Thank you, Maeve. I also wanted to mention that the book, whose cover you see there, we have copies of it in the soup, and if any of you are so moved, then do the right thing, and actually, it's very nice. Nina has agreed to sign copies of the books if you want to bring them to her in the reception afterwards. I think this is a really wonderful lecture. Well, Nina, you'll be angry at me. I didn't buy your book, but I received it as a freebie from your publisher, and it just showed up. It showed up in my mail one day, and I read this book, and I thought, this is really amazing. It's most of us, I think many of us, have followed the story of the James, the Ossuary, James, brother of Jesus, and to read a book about it that really brought together a series of strands that need to be brought together is it's a very valuable thing for all of us, that we like to believe that what we do is scientific research, and yet so much of what we do is founded in one way or another on faith of one sort or another. And there's the famous saying of some scientist, if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. And this is really the perfect example of that. So Ms. Burleigh's book really explores that interesting interface between scholarship, belief, commerce, faith, and skullduggery, which is it's really fascinating. Nina Burleigh is a third-generation University of Chicago person. Her grandfather went here, her father went here, and she went here for her master's degree. She's from the Chicago area originally. She spent a considerable amount of time in the Near East, and is currently, in addition to being an author, is also an adjunct professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. She's written a number of books in addition to journalistic articles in major magazines. She's written about Napoleon's scientists and the unveiling of Egypt as a Near Eastern topic, and is currently working on a book about the Amanda Knox murder case, murder trial in Perugia in Italy, which many of you may have heard about. So she covers a wide variety of topics. I think this one is probably the most appropriate for the Oriental Institute. And she has done extensive research on it, and in the course of that research, she has interacted with people in our broader Oriental Institute community, such as Morad Kursel, whose dissertation research on the whole practice of looting of archaeological sites and the Antiquities Trade really forms an important part of this whole narrative. So I think that it's a perspective on what we do that we normally wouldn't have a chance to really learn about and understand. And it's a fascinating thing that really causes us to question much of what we do and be more aware of the implications of our own professional and personal interests. So on that basis, I want to welcome you here, and I'd like, I think we'll all join in welcoming Nina Burleigh, who will speak to us on Unholy Business, a true tale of forgery, faith, greed, and forgery in the Holy Land.
Good evening, and thank you, Gil, for that introduction. And thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here at my alma mater and in this lovely room in this museum. I actually grew up in this area. My dad, when he was in graduate school here, we lived right down the street, and I actually played in that room over there with the winged bulls. So it's really quite an honor and to be back here, a real thrill. And I wish I'd heard that. I don't know which scientist said that about belief and knowledge, but I wish I'd known that, because that would have made a great, another great opening for the book. But thank you so much. I guess the first thing I want to say is I'm a journalist, as you know. I'm not an archaeologist or a scholar, and so a lot of people kind of the first thing they want to know is, why did you want to do this story? What is it about it that attracted you? And I can say that as it turned out that it became, doing this project actually allowed me to live out a bunch of childhood dreams. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist for a while, and then I wanted to be a detective. And what I got was an English degree, and I know how to correct papers and where prepositions are supposed to go. I'm supposed to know these things anyway, and it's a pretty boring kind of, I like it, but it sounds like a kind of a boring existence. Doing this book ended up allowing me to be both an archaeologist and a detective, and it was really fun to do. But how I got interested, I had no idea that I was going to end up doing these, becoming archaeologist and spy at the same time. I got interested in it because in 2004, I was working on another book involving archaeologists and French scientists in the 18th century who went to Egypt with Napoleon. And I was living in a house in upstate New York, and it was very cold and drafty, and it was winter. And I don't know how many of you here are writers or work on writing, but one of the things that we like to do is procrastinate. And so I was in this freezing cold house trying to channel the Sahara Desert and procrastinating every possible way I could think of. And one of those ways was to read the New York Times from cover to cover. And I had the New York Times upstairs on my desk one day, and I read this story. It was around New Year's of '04. And I read this story about, the headline was Fraud of the Century uncovered in Israel. And what it was a story about these guys who had been arrested, for getting together and taking genuinely old archaeological objects, real artifacts, and altering them to make them more valuable, and also to make them appear to relate to biblical tales, biblical stories, biblical characters. And I read this, and I don't know, I have to confess my political leanings here. And there was 2004, for a lot of those from my political persuasion, the fall of 2004 was a very unhappy time. In fact, we were in shock because of what had happened, the re-election of a president that we didn't think was going to get re-elected, many of us. And I also have covered politics for years, and I was very interested in what had happened there, and I read everything. And one of the groups that had been credited with the re-election were the evangelical Christians. And so I was very interested. I've become, over the years anyway, more interested in people of faith, I guess after 9/11 in New York, and just, the things that are happening in people of my generation in terms of belief. And I'm not a person who comes from a very religious background. I've become more and more interested in it. And so I read this article about this fraud of the century in Israel and what these guys have been doing, and I thought, how interesting. What kind of person would try to fool believers? Like what's going on there? What kind of a character would do this? And And I have to admit that the original motive was to kind of amuse myself, I guess, by thinking about this, because I wasn't happy that the evangelical Christians had helped reelect the president. Let me just move to. I have a very short slideshow here that I'm going to go through, and hopefully, the book. When you'll see, unfortunately, the book does not have any pictures in it, which the editor made a call that I think wasn't so great. But these are not the most exciting things to look at unless you're like Morag or Gill, who understand what these are. So I'll start with explaining what this thing is, because it's fundamental to the story, and then we can go from there. The crux of this crime lies in this box. The crux of the crime, the reason that it became that the activities of these forgers came to be known is because of this. What is this thing? Has anybody heard of the James Ossuary? Okay, so about half of you have. So I can I'm going to have to explain it to the other half. It's around the time of Christ's birth, for about 90 years in Israel, Judea then, the ancient Israelites, or the people who lived there then, buried their dead in an unusual way. They put the bodies in a cave, they closed them up in a dry place, and they waited a year until the flesh had fallen off the bones, and then they would take some of the bones and put them in these limestone boxes. So they're actually like coffins, but they're not coffin size. They're small. And these things are so common in Jerusalem. They're called ossuaries. They're so common in Jerusalem that people use them as planters. But some of them are not common. And the reason that they're not common is why this one is so special. Many of them have decorations on them. A few of them have actual writing on them. They're inscribed. And this one has writing on it in Aramaic that says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. This box came out of a private collection. It had been sitting around in Israel for a long time, according to the collector. And in 2002, it was released to the public. It was announced to the world that this box had been discovered. And it was presented to the world as the first archaeological evidence of Christ's existence. Big deal, right? This is a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal in the news. In 2002, the fall of 2002, it was on the cover of the New York Times. BBC covered it. CNN covered it. And it was brought into the public by a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who publishes a magazine called the Biblical Archaeology Review, which is a colorful, kind of popular magazine that goes out to a great number of amateur archaeologists in this country and amateur biblical archaeologists and people who believe in the Bible's literal truth and are interested in objects that back it up. So he brought this thing forward and at a press conference. First archaeological evidence of Christ. Now, I missed all that news. Scholars in this room did not miss it. I know that there were people who were paying attention to it here, but I didn't hear anything about it. It was only in 2004 when this forgery had been revealed and uncovered by the Israeli police that I heard about it. But I found I found this story really interesting, and I decided that I would go to Israel and try to write about it. And that was in 2006, 2 years after the news of the indictment of these 5 men. And so what I did was I got there in the fall. I flew over for a week just to see whether I would be able to do this project or not. I had never been to Israel before. I'd never been to Jerusalem. I'd been in and out of the Middle East, but I had never managed to make it there. How many people here have been to Jerusalem? Okay. Of course. So I had certain expectations about what I was going to meet there, as an American who consumes news here about Israel. So I had some trepidation, and I liked the story. I liked the idea of writing a book about it and examining more what had happened with this ossuary and who these people were, but I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it. So I got there, and it turned out that within a week I had met all of the major players in this trial: the forger, the alleged forger, the detective, the major collectors, because people collect this stuff, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I realized it was a place where I could work, and from there I began to go in and out of Jerusalem quite a bit for a year. And I didn't live there, partly because my family, I have children, and my husband didn't want to uproot and go there. So I stayed in East Jerusalem at the Albright Institute. How many people know what the Albright Institute is? Okay, it's a place for archaeologists in East Jerusalem. Jerusalem is divided into East and West, Arab or Palestinian and Israeli, and the Albright Institute has been there for about 100 years, and archaeologists from America and other places, but mainly it's American. It's an American association. Have worked there and do a lot of. They sleep there, and they do a lot of research there. People who are digging there will stay there. So I moved in there, and it's a really interesting place. It's the place where the people who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls worked. A lot of them lived there, and there's some interesting characters there. And one of the things about it is that because it's on the east side of Jerusalem, it's in the Arab side of Jerusalem, and so I would go to the old city from the front door of this institute. The old city being the part of Jerusalem that you see when you see pictures of the Gold Dome, and it's the ancient part of Jerusalem. And the reason I put this picture in is the Damascus Gate is kind of the Arab entrance to the east, to the old city, and I learned a lot in the first couple of weeks there, just from living on that side of Jerusalem, about Israel and about kind of the context for this story, because I was crossing back and forth the old, what they call the Green Line, the old dividing line between Israel and the Palestinian side of Jerusalem, and I just like to keep this picture in mind because it's a place where when you're an American, you're going in and out of Arab territory now, especially it was during the Iraq War. You have an idea of what you're going to find, and how you're going to be treated, I guess. And it was not that way at all. I was very welcomed, and in fact, I felt quite comfortable there. And what I learned right away is that Israel is a tiny, tiny country. It's the size of Vermont, And you can get from the news, you would think it's, because there's so much gravitas. It's like Washington, D.C. It's a tiny little place that has way more weight in world importance than its size would indicate. And the people of Palestine, or the West Bank, and Israel are squished right up against each other. And they coexist, or not, in a very small space. And so there's a lot of tension and a lot of kind of the soldiers on the streets. There are roadblocks put up willy-nilly if you're trying to travel around. But there's not open warfare. But it's much different from, there's not a lot of open conflict that I saw where I was. There were no bombings, but there were lots of sort of hassles to life there, inexplicable traffic jams, roadblocks, lots of people with weapons. So that was kind of my original immersion in this story. Sorry. Now, going in from the Damascus Gate, you're on what they call the Arab side of the old city. You can find your way to this. This is the Gold Dome is the kind of iconic image of Jerusalem that everybody recognizes, I think. But I don't know if everybody understands what it is or what it's called. So I'm going to give you just a little background on that before we get into these objects and why they're important. It's called the Temple Mount by Israelis, and by Palestinians and Arabs, and it's called the Haram al-Sharif. It's a mosque built on top of a mount that historically is believed to have been the place where the first and second temples of the Bible, Jewish temples, existed. The Wailing Wall, which everyone's seen pictures of, is at the bottom of this. You can't see it because this is the very top, and it's quite beautiful. The Muslims control the top of it. This is their turf. Underneath is believed to be the remains of, possibly, the remains of the temple, Solomon's temple, the original temple, and there certainly are the remains of the second temple, the temple that you read about in the New Testament. And the reason this is important is that it's violently contested turf. People want this. When I was there, every other day there were roadblocks being put up. If I was trying to cross town, there were people trying to take it back by force. And the Israeli police have to stand there and guard it. And there are guards all around it. And yet you get up to the top of it, and it's this very serene, holy, peaceful place. So very, what's the word? It's oxymoronic, I guess, to be up there. So that's just keep that in mind as we go through this. Now, most people go to Israel, most people go to Jerusalem these days as tourists. I mean, a lot of you are archaeologists or know about archaeology, but a lot of people go there as tourists. And a lot of them go there as tourists because they're wanting to see the places that they've heard about in Sunday school all their lives. It has a great deal of meaning for people beyond just its history, obviously, beyond just its political history or the history of its people. It's a holy place. It's called the Holy Land. And everything in it that has to do with the biblical, these stops that people go to if they're going on these Bible tours, every stop is monetized. So I like this picture because this is the Jordan River, and there's a place where you can go and tour. They're up in the parking lot. There are about 30 tour buses every day. disgorging many, many people, many of them Americans, Canadians, Europeans, Christians who are coming down, and you can rent a little white kind of like towel t-shirt thing, and you can go down and get in the water, and you're paying for it. And it's not just that. There are many other sites in Israel proper that are that you can go to on these tours, and that you pay for, and that where you learn about the history of Israel and the history of the site in the context of the Bible, not in the context of the history of the country or the history of the people who live there. For example, there's a place, the cave of, they believe they've uncovered the cave of John the Baptist. They tell you when you go there that it is the cave of John the Baptist, and people pay money to go there. But scholars don't necessarily agree that it is even the place where John the Baptist ever walked. There are places in Jerusalem like that people will pay money to go to. Basically, Christians have been coming to Jerusalem for centuries. Long before Israel existed as a country, long before Palestine was Palestine, all the way back to the beginning of Christianity in Europe, the 4th century. Constantine, his mother Helena, in the 4th century went there and came back with what she said were pieces of the true cross, and she identified the location where Christ had been supposedly had been crucified, and brought back bits of it. And now this has been going on for centuries. So now, when you go to Europe, I've just been living there for a little while in Italy. All the churches, even in this little town that I lived in, have relics from the Holy Land, supposedly from the Holy Land. The town I was in, Perugia, has this beautiful 12th century church in it, and high up in one corner, it only comes down once a year. It takes 14 keys to get to it. Is supposedly the Virgin Mary's actual wedding ring, brought from the Holy Land back to Italy sometime in the midst of the past, and with great peril. There's a whole story about how it got there. And you see this thing, and it's basically just a big round, like donut-sized piece of jade, maybe, but it definitely wouldn't fit on her finger. It was not a finger-sized ring. But anyway, it's a magnet for that reason, and it's also a place where people have for a very long time realized that they can sell things to people who are coming to get proof of their beliefs of the Bible. And one of the primary spots that you would go to get things like this, if you wanted to bring home a piece of it, you go to the old city, and it's filled with shops down these mysterious little lanes. You'll see these windows, and they're filled with things like this. And they look like museums, really. They look like things that you would see if you walked into this building and went over to the side and looked in the vitrines. And they all have they have a provenance, or there's a storekeeper who will tell you where it came from and what it is. And they're some of them are Roman, some of them are Byzantine, some of them are oil lamps from when Christ actually walked, and there are coins that date to the period of the money changers and so on, and you can buy them, and you can pay quite a bit of money, but you can take them home and have them. So there are numbers of stores like this, and I'll just show you another picture of one. I thought that was cute. That's a lion from supposedly a Byzantine lion. And some of it's really cool. I wouldn't mind having, I'm not a collector, and there were things that I thought, I wouldn't mind having that in my house, but I didn't buy anything yet. And this is the reason why. Sorry, I'm not a photographer. This is my attempt at getting the whole thing into the frame. My husband's a photographer, and I borrowed his camera, his like professional camera. So it's a good camera, but it's not. It's me. So anyway, I was trying to get a picture. This is called the Rockefeller Museum, and it's in East Jerusalem also, and it has a connection to the Oriental Institute. In the 1920s, it was built with a grant from John D. Rockefeller at the suggestion of archaeologists from the Oriental Institute to house finds from the region. But it's like everything else in this country, in this very fought-over country. It has a political history, and it's changed hands. So it started out as the Rockefeller Museum and the Oriental Institute, and the Anglicans ran it, or the English speakers ran it, and then it became the headquarters of the Palestine Archaeological Association. And then in 1967, in the 1967 war, the Israelis took that part of Jerusalem and actually used this they used the turret as a gunning area. And now it houses something called the Israel Archaeological Authority, the IAA. It's still a museum, and it's literally a stone's throw away from the Temple Mount. Like, it's over the wall from it. It's not in the old city. Anyway, the IAA is it's an tiny little agency that's set up to protect the 30,000 archaeological sites in Israel. It's a lot of archaeological sites in a place the size of Vermont. And it's very underfunded. There are 12 men who work there, and they are basically meant to keep the people from taking things from these sites, but they obviously are completely incapable of keeping track of everything. So this gentleman here is the head of the IAA. His name is Amir Ganor. He's an archaeologist, he's a scholar, and he's a cop. You can't see it, but he carries a Glock on the other side of his pants there. He never takes it off. He's a soldier, like all the Israeli men are. And he runs this organization. He's got 12 men. And one of his big jobs, because he can't possibly keep track of 30,000 archaeological sites, but one of his big jobs is to keep tabs on these guys in the old city who are selling things to tourists, who are selling the Herodian oil lamps or the Byzantine crosses for a lot of money. And he has a collection of interesting things that he's found in his work. And what he's holding right there is, I don't know if you can see it, he has a beautiful example of what they call over there Roman glass. Roman glass it's amazing that there actually is glass that exists in Jerusalem from Roman times. It's very pretty. It's mostly broken into bits, and people make jewelry out of it, or it's very pearlescent, and you can have a little piece of it and make a necklace, or you can find a whole vase, a jug, and then you're really in luck. And what he's holding in his hand there is a Roman glass vase that a tourist brought to him, for which he or she had paid $1,500. And he took one look at it, and he said, sorry, I don't think that this is worth $1,500, because if you x-ray it, it's actually that thing. Can you see what he's got in his other hand? It's a light bulb. Very, very beautifully decorated as a Roman glass 2,000-year-old jug. So he has a collection of stuff like this behind him in his office, along with a big Google Earth map of the old city. And this is kind of what he does. He keeps tabs on these guys if he can. He checks in with the dealers. They're all supposed to be licensed. So he checks in with them to see where they're getting their stuff and what they're selling it for and whether it's real. And by his estimation, 90% of what's in these little stores is fake. So, and he's an expert. So I don't know. I didn't buy anything. I ran into some people who were buying things, but if you go there, just keep that in mind. It's nice to have some of it, but don't pay $1,500 for it unless you have somebody like him look at it first. So anyway, back to our story. And I don't want to give the whole story away because I do hope some of you will buy the book. But the ossuary was under this man's purview. The fact that this thing was found in Israel, brought to the attention of the public, big famous find. That's his job to know what that thing is. And so CNN, the first time he hears about it is on the day that Mr. Shanks, the Biblical Archaeology Review editor, brings it forth at a press conference in Washington, D.C. CNN phones up this guy, whose English is not very good. And he gets the call, and okay, the first archaeological evidence of Christ has been found. It's being brought forth in Washington, D.C. Actually, it was going to be shown in Canada. They had found a museum that they were going to bring it to. It was no longer in Israel. And he was really annoyed because, first of all, he's going to be embarrassed. They were trying to get a comment from him, and he didn't even know what it was. And secondly, he found out pretty quickly who the collector was who it belonged to, and he had met with the guy a week before, 2 weeks before, and the guy had shown him his whole collection and, made sure everything was kosher, and had never said to him, oh, by the way, the first archaeological evidence of the existence of Christ belongs to me, and it's about to be sent to Canada, and I've insured it for $1 million. It's really important. So he was angry about that. And he started looking into it. Now, this is around 2002, the fall of 2002. But before he got too far into figuring out what was up with this ossuary, with this amazing inscription on it, he was distracted by something else. And then something else is what led to the unraveling of this mystery. He was told that in the museum in Israel, one of the major museums, had been shown a tablet with some writing on it. And it was a very important writing, very important tablet. It was so important that the guy who was showing it around to these museums had it in a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. And he was bringing it to the museum and these other places, and he was asking for a lot of money. And the museum was prepared to trade a Rembrandt or wire hundreds of thousands of dollars into a Swiss account for this tablet. Why? Because it turned out to have a text on it that was almost identical to a text in the Bible in 2 Kings 12, for those of you who know the Bible, Old Testament text, referring to repairs being made to Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple, the first temple, the temple which housed the Ark of the Covenant, the temple that had walls of gold that was sacked by the Babylonians. And here was this tablet that referred to repairs, and even in the language of the Bible. So this information about this was leaked out, and the newspapers in Israel had written about it. And the day that was in the newspaper, right after the ossuary had come out in the United States, Mr. Ganor gets a phone call from top political people in Israel saying, "What is this tablet? We need it right now in our hands." Why do they want this thing right now in their hands? Because it's an incendiary object. Because it basically says, here we have a piece of rock from thousands of years ago, that proves what we've always been saying all along, that underneath that mosque is that the ruins of this temple, the first temple, and Solomon's temple, which is a fundamental piece of a fundament of the Bible, the Old Testament, fundamental to the belief systems of Jews and Christians, and also fundamental to the notion that that mosque shouldn't be on top of it, and that, in fact, that piece of land called the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif should be called the Temple Mount, and whoever's on top of it put with the mosque should be out off that top of the mosque. And this is a big issue because in Israel, as I just told you, the soldiers are constantly protecting that place from people who want to take it back, and it's hotly contested turf. So Amir Ganor has to go out and find this tablet, and that's what he starts to do. Now, where does he go? One of the first places he goes, when he starts looking into this, he's got to go and meet the collectors. There's a small community of people in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv who know where all the really important things are in the unprovenanced world, biblical archaeology, not the archaeologists who are sitting in this room who know where all the important historical stuff is, but people who know where the stuff that's worth a lot of money and that's real is. This guy, his name is Shlomo Musayev, fascinating character. Biggest collector of biblical archaeology, biggest private collector of biblical archaeology in the world. He has 600,000 objects, and they're mostly in Switzerland because that's where you can put your stuff in these warehouses. But he also has an apartment in London, an apartment in Tel Aviv, filled with things. He's a wealthy jeweler, born in Arab Jerusalem, born before Israel existed. He's not a religious man, he told me. I interviewed him. Obviously, I wouldn't have this picture because I took that picture. And he's collected this stuff since he was a little kid on the streets of Jerusalem, in caves. He started collecting coins, and then he moved from coins to bigger stuff and bigger stuff and bigger stuff. And now he is known to write $1 million checks to people. They'll just come to his apartment with something, from Iraq or, Yemen or, anywhere that has to do with Jewish history. He's very interested in biblical history and proving not the Bible, not that God exists or that God gave, that the Ark of the Covenant was Solomon's temple, but that the history of the Jewish people in the Bible is real, and he's collected this stuff because he partly has that in mind. He also just has the collector mentality, and he likes to have more and more of these things in his collection. And I was in his apartment in Tel Aviv early on when I started working on this, and he showed me his stuff. He's got lions, supposedly lions that belong to the Queen of Sheba, millions of dollars worth of ancient coins, these things called seals and seal impressions, like wax seals, beautiful semi-precious stones that are seals with the names of Old Testament kings on them. And he sometimes will call a scholar to verify something. When I was there, his house is basically an indoor market, and when he's in Tel Aviv, people are coming in and out of his apartment, this penthouse on the Mediterranean, always with things to sell him. And I was sitting there interviewing him, and it was going on right in front of me. People were coming in with things wrapped in towels, and they would go off in a corner, and he would talk to them, and then he'd come back and continue to talk to me. And he just he doesn't often need to use a scholar because he feels like he's been in the business for so long of collecting this stuff. He knows what it is, so he just buys it, and he He's known to do that. He's known to write these gigantic checks, like $100,000 check. If he likes something, he'll just, on a gut feeling, he'll just pay for it. And then later, he might check and see what it is, make sure that it's, accurate. But not a forgery. But he's basically an excellent mark for anybody who wanted to make fakes. So Gnor went to him, the detective, and I just put this in here because people are always saying to me, "Oh, you went to Israel and you were in Jerusalem and you went around and it must have been so incredibly dangerous, and weren't you in peril?" And this is basically as perilous as it got. He's trying to give me a big wet smacker on the way out, and I was pushing his head away. So this guy here is, his name is Oded Golan. He's another member of the collector class in Israel. Not as big a collector as Mosiah, but big collector. And he happens to be the guy who owned the ossuary, the James Ossuary. He's an interesting character also. All these guys are interesting characters. He's a collector. He's totally secular. He's got a lot of money from his family. And he's lived kind of an interesting life. I mean, he's had he's trained as an industrial engineer, but he never really worked as an engineer. He's worked as a tour guide and traveled around the world a lot. And he collects ossuaries, and he collects other antiquities from the ground. They're plucked from the ground in this country where he was born. He's younger than Mosiah. He's one of the first generation. His parents were one of the first generation of emigres to then Palestine from Europe. They're like the Mayflower people, the or his grandparents. Sorry, they're Russians, and they came over and they lived in Palestine before it became Israel. And so he's an interesting guy. And the cops were basically, they went to his house to see what he knew about this ossuary, and they were quite suspicious of him because there were already scholars in the United States saying, "I don't know if that ossuary is real or not." And they didn't trust him, and they felt also that he may know something about this. They had heard that he may know something about this mysterious and incredibly important tablet. So they were interviewing him for a long time, and they followed him around. And the way that he does his business is, it's dirty. It's not. They all buy stuff from people who are looting sites. It's not. These objects don't come out of the ground on their own. Somebody's out there taking it, and they pay money for them. And so they followed him around, and finally, they noticed some weird things. They got warrants for his house, and they found these suspicious, I guess you could say, things, boxes of half-made figurines and plans for other inscriptions on paper, and they didn't trust. They didn't trust him, and they finally got the ossuary back from Canada, and they got the tablet out of his hands. He finally confessed that it was his. So they took these two objects to their warehouse. Well, actually, they took them back to their headquarters. And just a little digression here. This is the warehouse where they put the ossuary, and as you can see, you see how common they are. This is the downstairs of the building. It's just filled with them, just filled from across, on and on, endless numbers of ossuaries. Now, the archaeologists in this room understand this, but I just want to give you a little background on archaeology and the difference between archaeology and objects found by archaeologists and objects found by somebody like this collector. This here is a pot, a giant pot that maybe once held olive oil or something, And as you can see, it doesn't look very nice, right? It's basically just a bunch of pieces of crockery that somebody's managed to put together. But this is how they found it. This is how they find these things. Real archaeologists work in the hot burning sun. This woman was just sitting in the middle of a road, in a dirty road, dirt road, and she's sitting out there all day long with a little pickaxe and a little sponge, and that thing that looks like a bunch of rocks that you and I would just drive over, that's one of those pots that they're going to end up taking it, pulling it out of the ground and putting it together, and it's a piece of history, and it's explaining what the people of that part of the world in that time period, how they lived. And that's what archaeologists do. And they're the natural enemies of these collectors and these dealers because they want to find this stuff in the ground. And most of the time, they're toiling in obscurity. There's some of them right here who are doing that. And they are, once in your lifetime, you find some amazing thing. I mean, it's not like Indiana Jones. It's not glamorous, but they're working really hard, and they don't like these dealers and collectors who who pay a looter to come in the middle of the night and find like things that have not been broken, which you can still find there in tombs, and take them out and sell them for a lot of money. So what happened was they brought this is an archaeologist named Yuval Goran. He's a scientist. He's an expert in rocks and dating of archaeological objects. What they did was they brought these two objects back to the IAA warehouse in Jerusalem, and outside Jerusalem, and they formed a team of scientists to look at them. And this guy was one of the people that they put on their team. And it's really hard to find disinterested scholars in Holy Land archaeology because a lot of people come to it with a belief system. And as Gil said, I know it because I believe it because I know it. I know it because anyway, what he said, it made absolute sense. You find something you want to see it, and then you see it. And so a lot of this is going on with these objects. And so it was hard to find a disinterested person. And what they did was they picked this guy, Yuval Goran, who's a very soft-spoken guy. He just happens to be pretty secular. He's not a religious guy. And he works at the University of Tel Aviv. And they had him go with other people, but he was kind of the head of it. They had him go through and examine both the ossuary and the this tablet. And they found pretty quickly that the ossuary, the writing on it, where it said, James, brother of Joseph, brother of Jesus, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. The part that said brother of Jesus had these ancient ossuaries, because they've been sitting in caves for 2 centuries, a biological substance builds up on their surface called a patina, and the patina dates it in a way. And so what happened was there were letters. The second half of the inscription actually was cutting through the original patina, and they had stuck a different kind of biological material, very carefully made, so that you would only recognize it if you were like this man, who's extremely meticulous, and he has expertise in using a microscope to look at this material, and recognize that it was different from the biological material on the rest of the ossuary. And it also, when he looked at it even more closely, he found that it had been adhered with modern substance, adhered into these letters. And he called this substance James Bond, because it was like some kind of glue. But unfortunately, when he was working on examining it, he pulled it out. And this became very important when these guys went on trial, because no longer was the fake patina in the letters, okay? So anyway, that's as far as the ossuary. There are other reasons why they identified it as a forgery, but that was one of the main ones. And then as far as the tablet, same thing. I mean, the tablet was people who were expert in language, in ancient languages, looked at the language and said, no way, man, that is not ancient, it's not ancient Hebrew. It looks like it, but there are constructions that are not right. And plus the tablet itself was flecked with gold. And it was like too perfect, because the idea was that it had survived the burning of Solomon's temple, and because the Solomon's temple supposedly had walls of gold, that this thing had been inside and like gold had fallen into it. So it had been made specifically to look like that. At least this is what people who believe they are not real say. So anyway, fast forwarding, they went on trial, 5 guys, Oded Golan being the main alleged culprit. And they've been on trial since 2004. It's now 2010. They are still on trial today. What's happened is they put a lot of archaeologists in the stand. The defense has taken each individual. They have hundreds of archaeologists have testified, or at least 100, as of the time I was there. And these archaeologists will get up, and they're not used to being grilled by the most expensive lawyers in Tel Aviv, first of all. They're used to lecturing like I am to a room full of students. Half of them are falling asleep, and they're just telling people what they know. They're not used to defending it. And they've got these lawyers who just come in with a book that they wrote 20 years ago, and they say, well, but you said here, didn't you, Professor, that the letter bet could have an extra long leg on it. And that, he's just spent an hour saying it's a fake letter, because actually they never wrote their letters in the year 70 AD like that. And they hold up his book, and he just collapses. So basically what they've done is they put biblical archaeology on trial in this little tiny courtroom in Jerusalem. Nobody's even paying attention to it. They've got really expensive lawyers. 3 of the guys have been already let off for statute of limitations reasons. I think one guy served time because he's the Palestinian, and he was like involved in the actual looting of the stuff, so they threw him in jail for a while, but he's out. And the 2 main guys are still there. Oded Golan, still there, probably going to get out. And the other guy is his dealer. They hate each other now, but his dealer, this guy has an office in this building, and it's in Jaffa, which is outside of Tel Aviv. And this is where he sells his things, and I like that because it says licensed to sell ancient history, which he indeed is licensed to sell. And I just leave you with this image because that's basically the front door of his shop. And he's a major, major dealer. That's the trial is at the moment still going on very slowly, grinding to a close. They're probably going to be acquitted. And as one of the archaeologists at the University of Tel Aviv said to me, when they're acquitted, it's going to change things a bit, because in a few years you will see Muhammad's sword and Solomon's sandals, and they'll be for sale, and it's just the way it'll go. It'll just go on like that, and they'll have been verified. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. Thank you for listening to me. I really appreciate you. Thank you for having me.